All right, chapter 11. It snowed a little bit this morning and it's nice and cold. Good day to curl up with the book and read. So, I had often wondered what old Dan would do if little Anne got into some kind of predicament. One night I got my answer. For several days, a northern blizzard had been blowing. It was a bad one. The temperature dropped down to 10 below. The storm started with a slow, cold drizzle and then sleet. When the wind started blowing, everything froze, leaving the ground as slick as glass. There is a simile. Trapped indoors, I was as nervous as a fish out of water. Goodness, there's similes all over this. I told Mama I guess it was just going to be storm all winter. She laughed and said, I don't think it will, but it does look like it will last for a while. She ruffled up my hair and kissed me between the eyes. This did rile me up. I didn't like to be kissed like that. It seemed that I could practically rub my skin off and still feel it all wet and sticky and kind of burning. Sometime on the fifth night, the wind blew itself out and it snowed about 3 inches. The next morning, I went out to my doghouse, scraping the snow away from the two-way door. I stuck my head in. It was as warm as an oven. I got my face all washed by little Anne. Old Dan's tail thumped out a tune on the wall. I told them to be ready because we were going hunting that night. I knew the old ringtails would be hungry and stirring, for they had been denned up during the storm. That evening, as I was leaving the house, Papa said, Billy, be careful tonight. It's slick down under the snow, and you could easily twist an ankle or break a leg. I told him I would, and that I wasn't going far, just down the back of our fields in the bottoms. Well, anyway, he said, be careful. There'll be no moon tonight, and you're going to see some fog next to the river. Walking through our fields, I saw my father was right about it being slick and dark. Several times I slipped and sat down. I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the lantern, but I wasn't worried. My light was a good one, and Mama had insisted that I make 2 little leather pouches to cover the blades of my axe. Just before I reached the timber, old Dan shook the snow from the underbrush with his deep voice. I stopped and listened. He bawled again. The deep bass tones rolled out under the tall sycamores, tore their way out of the thick timber, traveled over the fields, and slammed up against the foothills. There they seemed to break up and die away in the mountains. Old Dan was working the trail slowly, and I knew why. He would never line out until little Anne was running by his side. I thought she would never get there. When she did, her beautiful voice made the blood pound in my temples. I felt the excitement of the hunt as it ate its way into my body. Taking a deep breath, I reared back and whooped as loud as I could. The coon ran upriver for a way, and then, cutting out of the bottoms, he headed for the mountains. I stood and listened until their voices went out of hearing. Slipping and sliding, I started in the direction I had just heard them. About halfway up to the foothills, I heard them coming back. Somewhere in the rugged mountains, the coon had turned and headed toward the river. It was about that time for him to play with a few tricks, and I was wondering what he would do. I knew it would be hard for him to hide his trail with snow on the ground, and I realized later that the smart old coon knew this too. As the voices of my dogs grew louder, I could tell that they were coming straight toward me. Once I started to blow out my lantern, thinking that maybe I could see them, and they crossed our field. But I realized I didn't stand a chance of seeing the race in the skunk-black night. Down out of the mountains they brought him, singing a hound dog song on his heels. The coon must have scented me, or seen my lantern. He cut to my right and ran between our house and me. I heard screaming and yelling from my sisters. My father started whooping. I knew my whole family was out on the porch listening to the beautiful voices of my little red hounds. I felt as tall as the tallest sycamore in the riverbank. I yelled as loud as I could. Again I heard the squealing of my sisters and the shouts of my father. The deep "Ows" of old Dan and the sharp "Ah" of little Anne bore a hole in the inky black night. The vibrations rolled and quivered in the icy silence. The coon was headed for the river. I could tell that my dogs were crowding him and wondered if he'd make it in the water. I was hoping he would, for I didn't want to wade the cold water unless I had to do it. I figured the smart old coon had a reason for turning and coming back to the river and wondered what trick he had in mind. I remembered something my grandfather had told me. He said never underestimate the cunning of an old river coon. When the nights are dark and the ground is frozen and slick, they can pull some mean tricks on the ground. Sometimes the tricks can be fatal. I was halfway through the fog-covered bottoms when the voices of my dogs stopped. I stood still, waited, and listened. A cold silence settled over the bottoms. I could hear the snap and crack of sap-frozen limbs. From far back in the Flinty Hills, the long, lonesome howl of a timber wolf floated down in the silent night. Across the river, I heard a cow moo. I knew the sound was coming from the Lowry place. Not being able to hear the voices of my dogs gave me an uncomfortable feeling. I whooped and waited for one of them to bawl. As I stood waiting, I realized something was different at the bottom. Something was missing. I wasn't worried about my dogs. I figured the coon had pulled some trick, and sooner or later they would unravel the trail. But the feeling that something was just not right had me worried. I whooped several times, but still could get no answer. Stumbling, slipping, and sliding, I started on. Reaching the river, I saw it was frozen over. I realized what my strange, uneasy feeling was. I had not been able to hear the sound of the water. So it is kind of strange when it snowed or when the weather changes things. So usually he would be able to hear that water, and it was probably more silent out. As I stood listening, I heard the gurgling out in the middle of the stream. The river wasn't frozen all the way across. The still eddy waters next to the banks had frozen, but out in the middle, where the current was swift, the water was running, leaving a trough in the ice pack. The gurgling sound I had heard was the swift current as it sucked its way through the channel. The last time I heard my dogs, they were downstream from me. I walked on listening. I hadn't gone far when I heard old Dan. What I heard froze the blood in my veins. He wasn't bawling on a trail or giving the tree bark. It was one long, continuous cry. In his deep voice, there seemed to be a pleading cry for help. Scared, worried, and with my heart beating like a churn dasher, I started toward the sound. I almost passed him, but another cry, he let me know where he was. He was out on the ice pack. I couldn't see him for the fog. I called to him, and he answered with a low whine. Again, I called his name. This time he came to me. He wasn't the same dog. His tail was between his legs, and his head was bowed down. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a dog where their tail is between their legs and they're looking down. So obviously he's upset. He stopped about 7 feet from me. Sitting down on the ice, he raised his head and howled the most mournful cry I'd ever heard. Turning around, he trotted back out on the ice and disappeared in the fog. I knew something had happened to little Ann. I called her name. She answered with a pleading cry. Although I couldn't see her, I guessed what had happened. The coon had led them to the river. Running out on the ice, he leaped across the trough. My dogs, hot on the trail, had followed. Old Dan, a more powerful dog than Little Ann, had made his leap. Little Ann had not made it. Her small feet had probably slipped on the slick ice, and she had fallen into the icy waters. Old Dan, seeing the fate of his little friend, had quit the chase and come back to help her. The smart old coon had pulled his trick, and a deadly one it was. So it's good to see that old Dan can care about little Ann enough to leave the raccoon. I had to do something. She would never be able to get out by herself. It was only a matter of time until her body would be paralyzed by the freezing water. Laying my axe down, I held my lantern out in front of me and stepped out on the ice. It started cracking and popping. I jumped back to the bank. Although it was thick enough to hold the light weight under my dogs, it would never hold me. Little Ann started whining and begging for help. I went all to pieces and started crying. Something had to be done, and